Hey Patreon backers, so this is the third. I actually was only going to do 2 back-to-back episodes. You're probably going to see this one about 3 weeks after I filmed it. So again, if you haven't seen your questions pop up, give me a little bit of time. This is the last time I'm doing for this series, and then I'll pick up the new questions. So yeah, we had enough to do 3, and I guess we'll just start. I've got, same note as always at the beginning. If you don't know how to post your question for these, I'm not checking Patreon for it. Sorry, I have too many different things to look at in terms of social media to kind of keep an eye on everything. So to make it easy for me to get to your question, do a Google search for Connect Patreon to Discord, follow the instructions there, and that'll get you connected. You can join the server and post your questions in the Ask GN Questions channel, and I'll take those there. Okay, first one is from JaskIJ, jeez, I can't read today. Says, Steve, have you thought of making an online website or database where we could look up your test data? We would probably need a Kickstarter or something. I know what you're asking. Technically, there is a website, and you can look up the data for reviews. Gamersnexus.net. It's easiest to search it just on Google. Look for the review, site:/gamersnexus.net. But I know what you're really asking for is like a database where you can like toggle different things and scroll through a whole bunch of charts or a whole bunch of raw numbers. Have I thought of it? Yes, I've thought of a lot of things, what we can do with the website. Unfortunately, the reality of it is that YouTube is enough of a daily job where I can barely keep up with it now. And the website's really hard to keep up with, but I do it because I like it, because I like the reference data. I know a lot of people like the reference data. We don't really make money on the site. In terms of the ads on it, I think we've got like 3 ads, and they're just AdSense, and I leave it there. So it's by design not intrusive with ads. That also means it doesn't make a lot of money. I don't really know what it makes, to be honest. Probably less than $1,000 a month for sure. So we don't really make money on the site, which means that it's difficult for me to dedicate the time away from YouTube. It's not like I can't create more time, obviously. So I'd have to cut it somewhere, and it'd be YouTube. And then that's not a good decision for a lot of reasons. At some point, hopefully we'll have the manpower where I can do that. I do want to rebuild the site anyway. Typically, my biggest window for that is around Christmas every year because everything slows down for about a week. So that's when I try to rebuild the site if I'm going to. That would not include doing like a custom database or CMS. That would just be updating the front end and the back end. But so that might happen. I missed the window last year due to workload, but we might rebuild it this year around that time. As for building like a custom database, even a Kickstarter, we have the money to build it. Patreon, makes that easily possible. So it's not an issue of having the money for it. It's an issue of not even really finding talent, because I could find someone to hire. There's plenty of skilled developers out there. It's a problem if I'd have to sit down with them and draw out a spec of what I want, and then we'd have to do a bunch of testing, make it work the way we want. That's not a time-friendly process. So really the challenge is time. I hope to at some point do stuff like that, but for now, unfortunately, the best way to do it is just look up the reviews independently and look at a review-by-review basis. Next, or methodology-by-methodology basis if you want to compare stuff. Next one is from 410, I think, or 41010. It's hard to read the dates in here too. Do you use any free or paid productivity tools or utilities? If so, which ones and why? Examples: File Explorer replacements, Notepad++, Screenshot, FTP SSH clients, any random utilities. Not really. Notepad++ is the one that jumps out to me. I really like Notepad++. It's super easy to work with batch files, and like for example, if you're looking at I don't know, Minecraft, for example, when I was benchmarking Minecraft, if I remember correctly, it was one of the games we benchmarked recently, but it would spit out a file, and what you could do is kind of just scroll through it and look at the data parsed more easily to read. So yeah, Notepad++ I like a lot. Next one, Nori says, has any manufacturer pushed back towards your product improvement recommendations, citing sales figures or trends? Let's see, and I guess that's the end of the question. So not really, like pushed back, no, not really. Provided insight too, yeah, so sometimes, this doesn't happen as much anymore, but back before I did all the factory tour stuff, every now and then we get like a, hey, this thing you're asking for, this is how it would be made, not really possible with the price point, stuff like that. Normally it's information regarding price and how much it costs to do something and why they can't do X, Y, Z. The other thing, we're providing sales figures and trends. Yes, definitely. I've gotten a lot of those. Can't publish any of them, but one of the things I learned really early on was the impact of RGB on sales. And some of the companies were telling us off record, and I can't name them, but were telling us that they saw 60% higher sales like for like, same product, RGB, not RGB, even if the price went up. And often there's more margin baked into that too, because it's easy for them to, not as much anymore, but it's easier for them to upcharge RGB than other stuff because it doesn't cost as much. So the answer is yes, we've gotten feedback on stuff like that. No one's really pushed back. Like most of the time the PMs agree with what we're saying for the most part, but then you get to sales and they're like, well, it doesn't matter because people buy this. So it doesn't really matter what you think. They're buying this 10 times more than that. So yeah, that's normally the type of information we get. Sultan Mudshi says, what happened to the fan testing plans? Any plans on reviewing cheaper air coolers for smaller CPUs? Yes to the latter question. I need to do like a roundup. We've been focusing on the high end first to fill in the charts, and the low end comes in later. Fan testing, same thing that happened with the cooler testing. I promised those air cooler roundups probably something like end of 2017, I think, or 2018, and we just got to it this year. But it's really good, and I really like the testing methodology. I'm very confident in the data. I feel like it provides a lot of insight that wasn't necessarily provided as much elsewhere. Sure, maybe a few places, but not too commonly. So it took a long time to really get around to finding the time to do that. And it's the same thing with fans and anything else we test, where it takes a lot longer than expected to really get into it. Because the problem is, once we start looking at that stuff, I always want it to be the best possible testing within our means. And so like with the CPU coolers, you start testing it, oh, this should be easy, and you find out here's the million ways that the testing can be invalid. And you start narrowing that down into just a few things that can invalidate it. Same thing with fans. The more I think about what I want to do with it, the more I realize how many variables there are. So like, for example, it's not as simple as just throwing a fan on the tunnel and testing CFM, because now I want to throw a fan on the tunnel with a radiator, and a fan on the tunnel with a dust filter, with a case panel. There's so many different things you could do to test things like static pressure performance, radiator performance, it's kind of the same thing, but just straight airflow. It gets really complicated really fast. The test matrix expands, and then it becomes a challenge of how much can you really do per review. So we kind of have to build the matrix and then narrow stuff down to, well, this test kind of covers the same thing as these three. Close enough. Let's just go with this one. So that's the process I haven't gone through yet with fans. Huskin, do you have plans to cover more VR-related topics or questions? Give us an example of Steam VR Motion, NVIDIA VR Max pre-rendered frames, things like that. So we did one of the first VR benchmarks. It was us and PC Perspective did some of the first virtual reality benchmarks with software. It was something that it was really a pain to do. I mean, first of all, getting the software working took several months because it took all kinds of adapters and cables and stuff. That was extra. We had to work with NVIDIA. NVIDIA was retooling FCAT into FCAT VR. It was one of their engineers. So he had an engineering focus. It wasn't really a marketing focus as much. And the software worked good. It was open in the sense that we could see they weren't doing anything screwy with AMD's data versus theirs. NVIDIA just at the time had a VR advantage, and so obviously they had an incentive to show that. But from our perspective, it was, okay, this is some software we can use to make sure it's fair and not cheating anything. It's not, so okay, now let's figure out how to use it, because it's actually valid information, pretty helpful. We ended up testing mostly CPUs. I did a 1700 versus an Intel CPU. We never did NVIDIA versus AMD with it, which, well, I mean, that's probably where it would have made more sense, but knowing that NVIDIA wanted that, I started with CPUs. And doing that one test, I was really proud of the data. I thought the charts were awesome. It was really cool information. You can go look up Gamers Nexus Virtual Reality R7 1700 benchmark or something. Really liked it, but man, it is the hardest thing to test, because physically you're subjecting yourself to testing some scenarios where it's just going to be a sickening experience because you're driving the FPS down so low intentionally to figure out how bad it is. So it doesn't really feel good. You do like 8 hours of testing in VR. It's a lot different than staring at a screen for 8 hours and running a standard gaming benchmark on a screen, something that's basically two-dimensional. So you do the same thing for VR and just start feeling kind of sick, get like a pounding headache from it because you're running 60 FPS and something that just scientifically needs to be 90, otherwise you get sick. So not a great experience, very difficult for those reasons. And it's something I could do more of, but there's just frankly not enough interest in it to justify the upfront expense of figuring out how do we do the testing. The people we worked with on that VR suite aren't there at NVIDIA anymore, so we'd probably have to retool it and do something custom. And it's just, I mean, there's just not enough interest for me to really justify it. Also, the bigger thing too is, for the most part, VR is not that difficult to run. I know it's gotten more complex, but there's kind of like, this is a reasonable class of CPU and GPU to buy and up, and then you don't really care too much about the differences, especially since it's basically running at the same frame rate. So it does make it hard to justify. Let's do maybe one more or two more if I can. Rusty says, with silicon content tailing off soon, will CPU content, cooler content, be back in the docket for future videos? I'm interested to see how the NAG12A does with its claims of 140 mil performance in a smaller package. Mentions the scythe coolers as well, actually. Or the scythe coolers that have fans that run backwards to allegedly remove turbulence. Also, once most of the relevant coolers have been tested, a piece on what makes the best so good would be interesting. I agree with you on that. For example, trying different fans on the best heat sinks or radiators and fans from the best coolers tested on worst performing packages. That's all really interesting, and several of these are things I've considered, but we just haven't had enough data yet to work with. So yeah, as the CPU stuff has slowed down the last couple weeks, last week or two, I've been doing more cooler stuff. We should have the graphite stuff up for a long time. By the time this goes up, we'll have the a special dust test that's already live when this goes up. So that it did pick up, you're right about that. As for testing things like the scythe coolers, we've had a lot of requests for, to the extent that I start to question if it's just someone from Scythe posting them, but I know I've seen you in the Discord before, so it'd be a really long con to do that. Scythe, I'm interested, I just need to get around to it. It's another one of those, like, if other people start drumming up enough interest that we can then buy it and actually get views on it, it's a lot easier for me. So I've seen some other people starting to cover Scythe stuff lately. That's good because it generates interest where people will recognize the names when we upload a video. They're not like, I don't know what that is, and just skip it. That's really what we're trying to avoid these days. So I can get to it now that more people are aware of what they make. Let's see, NHE12A. I need to ask Noctua for a few of the A variants of their coolers too, yeah. But yeah, we're working on more cooler stuff now in between CPUs. Last one, Corgal Jr. What is the base RPM for Asetek Gen 5 pumps? According to EVGA customer service, the lowest speed should be 2,000. Seems a bit excessive, but I'm not a water cooling expert. That's pretty normal, and that is a low speed. There is a pretty big impact in some loops from lower pump speeds, so you have to be careful running in silent mode. Asetek, top of my head, will read something like 2,000 to 2,600 RPM. Keep in mind that if you're dealing with something like an 8-pole motor, you plug it into something that's expecting a 4-pole fan, you're going to get an RPM that's not accurate, so you might need to divide it by 2 or something like that, depending on how many poles the fan header expects versus what the pump has. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, 2,000 to 2,600 is pretty normal. 2,600 is the high end, 2,000 is low, and you'll see a bit of a performance fall off at 2,000. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting us directly. Again, it does help fund all the stuff that we want to do. And I guess post questions for the next one. We'll see you all next time.